So last month, President Trump at a rally said that our U.S. farmers are really over the hump with regard to the tensions and difficulties that they've been facing with the trade wars we're having. And I have to say, based on the conversation that I've just had this morning, plus many other heartbreaking conversations with other agricultural sectors and farmers present in the state of Wisconsin, that it couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, in some cases, it seems like the worst is yet to come. Ginseng is grown uh, uh, in Marathon County. It is a product that people here have been growing for generations, that they are so proud of. And it's the number one county growing ginseng in the United States, and certainly in Wisconsin. And about 80 to 85% of its product is ultimately sold and used in China. But certainly it's in high demand in Asia. And they have seen over the last couple of years the tariff go from 7.5% to now, I believe the total is 41.5%. That is a huge change, and it has resulted in difficulty in selling last year's crop, just at the point where this year's crop is about to be harvested. The aid, and farmers really aren't looking for trade aid. They'd rather have markets that are functioning and purchasers. But the aid that is being offered is really a drop in a bucket. And we have a lot more work to do together to end the harm of this trade war.
So then, how do you see a path out of this? I mean, do you have the solutions, or is it something you're working on?
Well, first of all, I think that the approach that the Trump administration has been taking has been so scattershot and haphazard. We need to really focus on what the goals are for trade with market economies, and in China's case, to recognize that China is a non-market economy that subsidizes many of its industries to try to undercut U.S. industries, and that we have to realize that we're talking both manufacturing and agriculture and many other industries where we need a level playing field for competition in a market that doesn't work off competition in China. So I think there's several straightforward things we need to do that involve all of those sectors, but certainly our situation in agriculture with China is dire. And with the escalation on both sides, President Trump vowing a new round of tariffs on $300 billion worth of Chinese products, and China then saying, well, we're going to cut off agricultural imports. Whether that will happen or not, we don't know, but that's a huge consequence to rural America and certainly to Wisconsin's agricultural sector. And with a product that goes mostly to China, it's critical.
Some farmers might argue that it was unfair before. It's certainly unfair now. I talked to one recently who said that something had to be done. He might not agree with the tactics of President Trump, but is there a way that we can perhaps level the playing field, because there was kind of a trade deficit even before this trade war happened?
Yeah. I am working on a bipartisan basis on legislation that looks at one of the really big factors in the overall lack of a level playing field that isn't often talked about, perhaps because it gets so complex, etc. But it's really about currency and money manipulation, and how the dollar is devalued. This sets up an advantage from one side or the other, and I think that we've always failed to call out China's currency manipulation, But if you think about it, that impacts every transaction. Tariffs impact the transactions where the tariff has been laid. And so if you look at the multiplying effect of either currency manipulation or devaluing, there's a word there, devaluing, that if you look at that, it has a compounding impact. And so I think there's a lot more we can do there. I know it's getting in the weeds, a pun I shouldn't use in a field, but in any event, I think that's something that could make a big difference.
So is that going to be your priority going back to Washington, is really cracking down on this kind of currency exchange?
Well, a number of the measures that I've introduced do deal with the currency issues, but I always want to make sure that when there is a direct hit to one of our industries, whether it's in manufacturing or agriculture, that we have a specific response to.
Now, the administrative response to the tariff crisis in general has been the MFP
Yes.
funding primarily, and we heard around the table today that that's about 1/5 of what they're actually losing due to the tariff war. What are you going to go back to Washington and do about that now? I mean, we can't really change the second round of MFP now that it's been announced. What's the answer there?
Well, it's very early on in the rollout of that, and I'll tell you that I had a chance to speak with Secretary Sonny Perdue, who is the Secretary of Agriculture for this country, and one of the things that I wanted to talk to him about early on is how it was going to be rolled out, how it was going to be different than the first round of trade aid that we saw, knowing very well that in almost every case, the farmers I represent from Wisconsin do not want bailouts or handouts or anything like that. They want an effective market. And so I talked to the Secretary about the need for attention to our specialty crops, and certainly ginseng and cranberries, for example, are specialty crops, not the typical commodity crops that they also focus on. I talked about the need to make sure that these funds don't go to overseas corporations that have ownership of some of our agricultural sectors, like the billionaire brothers who got what was it, $62 million of a last round of trade aid in Brazil. I talked about how we really also needed to make some of this money available to expanding markets. And it was an interchange, but it didn't strike me that they were looking at being as creative as we can on how to lessen the harmful impact on these hardworking families and operations, and that's very hard to watch.
What kind of creativity are you looking for?
Well, in the last Farm Bill, 5-year Farm Bill, one of the things that I authored and got passed was an innovation and value added program. Part of it was focused on our crisis in dairy in the state of Wisconsin, but it was not limited at all to one sector of our agricultural economy. But the idea of equipping farmers or their processors with the ability to add value so that they can withstand this really difficult time.
Got time for one more. I know.
Yeah, no, that was good for me for ginseng.
Okay.
Yeah.
You
Oh,
wanna
yeah.
go over it.
So, to talk a little bit about the shootings. Right now, we're in recess. Would you be willing to go back to Washington during this recess for any promises with anything concerning mass shootings?
I would leave in a moment's notice if I believed that we could get something done. And I think one of the most heartbreaking things at a moment, where there's a necessity to look at this as a moral issue and see moral leadership, is that doing nothing is unacceptable. And so we watch these tragedies over and over again, and nothing happens, and nothing happens. And so, yes, if we could move forward on this issue, I would be out there in a second.
Now, the president referenced possible background checks in a tweet this morning. He
Yes.
wasn't specific. What specifically would you be looking at supporting if something were, if you were, bills were
Well, I do think
introduced?
that that's the most unifying issue around the gun safety debate in this country. And let me just say, first of all, I'm a gun owner, and I strongly support the Second Amendment. But I do not believe that there's an inconsistency with thorough background checks in the Second Amendment. And we have loopholes where there's sales and exchanges that aren't subject to a background check, and I think we should close that. And I agree, if that's indeed what was tweeted this morning, that shows an opening for cooperation and agreement. And then I think that there's other aspects of that the databases are often insufficient. We saw the instance where a military criminal conviction wasn't reflected in the background database. So just making them more comprehensive would be one step, that in my mind, again, is totally consistent with the Second Amendment.
Thank you. We're out of time. Thank you.